This is Fothentic History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Brian Young.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Holly,
Yeah.
how do you feel about the whole Empire?
Well, I love their style, but I can't get on board with what they stand for.
Well, what about one of the symbols that really exemplifies them?
Well, I know what you're getting at. And from a historical perspective, I mean, I'm always fascinated by all history, whether it's the good or the bad. So I'm in, and you can't really deny some of the amazing technology, particularly in the military realm, that the Empire created.
Yeah, so as we alluded to, across the galaxy, there has been no greater symbol of Imperial control than Star Destroyers. And they came in many shapes and sizes, but they all have at least some things in common. And first, they all shared a rough pyramidal shape, the point ending at the front of the ship as though it could pierce another ship like a dagger. And protruding from the top of the ship was the bridge and deflector shield generators, and they carried troops and ships and were the height of military superiority.
Star Destroyers came in many classes, but they began use for what was then the Republic during the Clone Wars with the Venator-class ship. And the Galactic Republic Navy had a fleet of them to use to interdict separatist blockades, transport clone armies, and they were basically commanded by naval commanders and Jedi generals. Because of their use by the Jedi, early Star Destroyers were referred to actually as Jedi cruisers, though others, uncomfortable with the Jedi, referred to them even then as Republic attack cruisers.
Venator-class ships saw conflict at some of the most notable battles of the Clone Wars, including Christophsis, Coruscant, Cato Nemoidia, Kashyyyk, Sullust, and Utapau. The Confederacy even tried designing specific capital ships to disable the Venator class, including the Malevolence, but they were no match for the ingenuity of the Republic and its commanders.
Early versions of the Venator-class Star Destroyers had hangar space that was accessed by large doors atop the ship, but this design was actually replaced toward the end of the war with much smaller doors on the dorsal side of the ship, replacing the empty hangar space with cannons, cranes, or other features. Generally, Venator-class ships were almost 1,200 meters long, and they boasted a full 8 engines.
So, as the Republic transitioned into the Empire, Venator-class ships were converted to use, but the larger, more impressive Imperial-class Star Destroyers were built. Shipyards across the galaxy, including Kuat, Corellia, Ringovinda, and Fondor, were converted to produce these ships in massive quantities.
There were 2 variants of Imperial Star Destroyer, the Imperial I class and the Imperial II class. The Imperial I class ships were about 1,600 meters long. That makes them almost 500 meters longer than their predecessors, the Venator class that we just talked about. And these were fully staffed with a crew of 37,000 and a complement of almost 10,000 stormtroopers, which made the population of an Imperial I class Star Destroyer somewhere in the range of 47,000 people, plus any passengers that might be aboard.
An advantage of the size of the Imperial class was that it could hold up to 2 years of consumables, making the most of their time on missions, putting down rebel cells, signs of sedition, and otherwise policing the galaxy.
They also had room to keep small armies aboard for both space and land battles. Imperial-class ships were equipped with 10 turbo-laser emplacements, 60 ion cannons, and 10 Phylon 7 tractor beams. Most Imperial-class Star Destroyers boasted 72 TIE fighters, which were the preferred space fighter of the Empire, 8 Lambda-class shuttles, which were their preferred transport ships, 20 heavy AT-AT walkers, or AT-AT, depending on how you like to pronounce it, and 30 of either the AT-ST or AT-DP two-legged walkers, and 15 Imperial troop ground transports.
One important Imperial I-class Star Destroyer was the Imperial Star Destroyer, or ISD, Chimera. It was commanded by Thrawn in the lead-up to the official outbreak of the Galactic Civil War, and later served as his command ship when he was promoted to Admiral and then later Grand Admiral, and this made it the primary command ship of the 7th Fleet.
The ship itself actually had a few key differences from other Imperial I class ships in the fleet. So for one, it had engraved on the bottom of the hull a rendering of a Chimera, a monstrous 3-headed creature with spider legs, 6 eye stalks, and 2 independent serpentine heads. The turbo laser turrets surrounding the command area of the Chimera were also much more robust, with 8-barrel guns rather than the standard doubles. And it also had hangars on both the dorsal and the ventral sides of the ship.
Thrawn himself was a rarity in the Imperial Navy, a non-human chiss with blue skin and a brilliant mind for tactics. Rebels and Imperials would agree, though sometimes begrudgingly, that he was one of the most brilliant naval tacticians and strategists who'd ever lived. The Chimera was used under Thrawn's direction to smash Rebel cells. Early in the conflict, one of its greatest successes was eliminating the cell run by the Rebel mastermind known only as Night Swan.
As Thrawn gained more and more notoriety aboard the Chimera as part of the 96th Task Force, he was granted the rank of Grand Admiral, as we mentioned, and it was his success in dealing with rebels and outthinking them that brought him to Lothal to help Governor Arinda Price deal with the rebel cell known as Phoenix Squadron, and that squadron was operating in and around that sector.
While using the 7th Fleet to blockade and strangle Lothal, Thrawn played a systematic game of cat and mouse with the rebels, allowing him to learn their weaknesses and track them to their secret hideout on the planet of Atollon.
Allowing the rebels no time to prepare, Thrawn appeared at the secret base of the rebels with much of the 7th Fleet, including 2 interdictor cruisers, which made it impossible for any escaping ships to get to lightspeed.
Although Thrawn ended up victorious at the battle, it was not without setbacks, and could have ended much of the rebellion in one swift stroke had Thrawn's orders been followed to the letter by his subordinates. Unfortunately, insubordination from those in his command, specifically Admiral Constantine, allowed an opening for a rebel ship to escape and bring back reinforcements.
Thrawn, from the Chimera, was able to force the rebels from their secret base, however, and cause significant damage to their capabilities to wage war against the Empire.
Now, the last Imperial I class Star Destroyer that was constructed by the Imperial Navy was, for a time, the personal flagship of Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith. And this was the ISD Devastator, and it participated in some of the most important conflicts during the Galactic Civil War.
The Devastator came out of the shipyards with a standard configuration, but it was upgraded significantly to make it essentially indistinguishable from the Imperial II class ships that were used later during the conflict.
During the Rebels' first victory at Scarif, the Devastator, under the command of Darth Vader, arrived like the cavalry. Its arrival cut off the escape of the Rebel fleet, and in fact, a Rebel GR-75 medium transport almost immediately crashed against the hull of the Devastator, and the Star Destroyer didn't even have a scratch on it.
It went to work disabling as many ships of the fleet as possible, including the Mon Calamari flagship Profundity, where it was learned that they'd received the secret plans to the Death Star, and Vader boarded the Profundity, and he chased the plans to the Tantive 4, which was an Alderaanian CR-90 corvette, but that ship ended up escaping.
Knowing the plans were vital to the Empire, Vader used the Devastator to track the Tantive 4 to Tatooine, where it tractored the ship into its hold and boarded it, capturing Princess Leia Organa in the process.
Vader was promoted to the Super Star Destroyer Executor after using the Devastator to track down a fleet of whale ships that were owned by the mysterious Dr. Silo in the Crushank Nebula. Dr. Silo was a cybernetically enhanced human who had developed a way to clone himself and transplant his consciousness into new clones. He was instrumental in fighting the rebels, but he grew jealous of Vader and he hatched a plot to kill him. Vader decided that he had to track him down, so he killed him, and then Palpatine gave him command of the Executor.
At this point, Admiral Jared Montferrat, who some claimed bore a strong resemblance to Imperial scientist Galen Erso, took command of the Devastator. It did, however, remain part of Vader's personal flotilla, which was known as Death Squadron.
Under Montferrat's command, the Devastator participated in the Battle of Hoth, where it served with distinction, shooting down transports and rebel ships. The ship met its end, however, at the Battle of Endor. The Devastator was defending the Imperial fleet from the rebel attack against the second Death Star when a squadron of B-Wings, known as Blade Squadron, attacked.
2 rebel pilots, Gina Moonsong and Braylon Stram, managed to cause a chain reaction that destroyed the Devastator and all aboard, ending its service there. And like I said, that was the last Imperial Class 1 off the assembly line, and this is how it met its end.
One Imperial I class Star Destroyer to survive through the Battle of Endor was the ISD Inflictor. It had been commanded at various times by officers including ISB Commander Brisney, Commander Erisher, and Commander Nash Windrider. But it was with Captain Sienna Ray that the Inflictor saw the end of its service.
After Endor, the Imperial fleet was moved to Jakku, the Empire's last major weapons facility. Shortly before the battle, Grand Moff Rand gave command of the Inflictor to Sienna Ray, a human female from the planet Jellican. During this battle, the Inflictor and hundreds of other ships participated in a flawed, centralized strategy to defend the planet against overwhelming New Republic forces, and we'll talk about that later.
Captain Ray saw the flaw in the situation and contacted the Grand Moff to convince him to split the fleet in an attempt to snatch a stalemate on Jakku from the jaws of defeat. But it was then that the Inflictor was boarded by 4 New Republic boarding ships. It was the intent of the New Republic to capture the vessel, so the boarding parties disconnected the self-destruct system, and that would have been Captain Ray's first option. She absolutely would have chosen to do that rather than let the Star Destroyer fall into the hands of the New Republic.
Instead, she ordered all hands to abandon ship and decided to scuttle it on the surface of Jakku, rendering it unusable by the New Republic. Rebel forces, including Thane Carell, a New Republic pilot from Jellican as well, who'd been a lover of Captain Ray's, managed to make his way to the bridge in an effort to stop the ship from crashing, or short of that, save the life of the Imperial he still loved.
Carell managed to stun the captain and get her into an escape pod while the Inflictor impacted on the surface of Jakku, where it remained for at least 30 years as part of the landscape and was visible from Nema Outpost on the planet.
So now we're going to get into the Imperial II class Star Destroyer, and those were known colloquially as the Imp Star Deuce, and these ships replaced the Imperial I class. And they were built primarily at Kuat shipyards in the Kuat system, and one of the primary differences between the 1 and 2 class Imperial Star Destroyers was the additions of a communications tower situated between the deflector shield domes.
The ISD Tyrant was an Imp Star Deuce that participated in the Battle of Hoth. It was actually the first ship to attempt to intercept fleeing rebel forces, but it was hit by a planetary-based ion cannon that rendered the ship useless. It floated, unable to move in space for the rest of the battle.
The ISD Vehement was another Imp Star Deuce in service after the Battle of Yavin. This one, commanded by Captain Hove, was under the personal direction of Alicia Beck of the Imperial Security Bureau. It was destroyed at the Battle of Endor.
Another really important Imperial II-class ship that we have to talk about was the Star Destroyer Avenger, commanded by Lorth Nida. And this ship also participated in the Battle of Hoth, and it was used to track down rebel elements that had escaped in that battle. It was instrumental in tracking the Millennium Falcon into an asteroid field near the Anoat system.
It was the Avenger that Boba Fett, the notorious bounty hunter, hid his ship, the Slave One, after the Millennium Falcon had attached itself to the outside of its hull in an attempt to escape. This wasn't detected by Captain Nida or his troopers, costing Nida his life, but Boba Fett was able to use this to capture, or lead Darth Vader to capture Han Solo after the Battle of Hoth.
The ISD Torment was an Imp Star Deuce that managed to escape destruction at the Battle of Endor and participated in Palpatine's Operation Cinder over the planet of Naboo. Operation Cinder, in case you have not heard of it, was Palpatine's plan to devastate Imperial planets in the event of his death, and this included his home planet, which was Naboo. The Torment activated a series of satellites around the planet that formed a climate disruption array. And this attempt eventually ended in failure as Princess Leia Organa, Sosha Saruna, who was at the time the Queen of Naboo, and rebel pilot Shara Bey took flight in Royal N1 starfighters and managed to destroy the satellites.
As a side note, Operation Cinder lasted for months after the Battle of Endor and targeted other planets as well, including Fondor, Burnin Khan, Kandavant, Abedneto, and Commodore, among others. This contingency of Palpatines ended with the remnants of the Imperial fleet fleeing to the unknown regions.
The next evolution in Imperial Star Destroyers was Executor-class Star Dreadnoughts, which were colloquially referred to as Executor-class Star Destroyers. These ships were massive. We literally cannot overstate their size. At 19 kilometers in length, they were 100 times larger than standard Imperial I and II class Star Destroyers. 100 times. They shared similar characteristics in shape and bridge geography, but that's pretty much where the similarities ended.
It took a crew of almost 281,000 officers, gunners, and enlisted troops to operate an Executor-class ship. Executors were powered by one main reactor with a series of secondary reactors and 13 engines placed in 5 thruster banks, giving it an impressive speed for a ship its size. They had more than 5,000 weapons placed on the hull, including turbo lasers, assault concussion missile launchers, and ion cannons.
But even though it was massive and impressive just for its size, there were some flaws in the design. The ventral and dorsal sides of the ship were virtually undefended, and that meant that starfighters had to be used to protect those quadrants of the ship. On the top, there was also a cityscape, giving approaching fighters the ability to use trench warfare tactics very similar to those used to destroy the first Death Star.
A minimum of 144 starfighters were carried aboard Executor-class ships, though the massive hangars could hold thousands if necessary. They also carried landing craft, dropships, transports, prefabricated garrison bases, and much more. According to Rebel intelligence, at least 12 Executor-class super destroyers were manufactured, that's staggering.
That's an expensive endeavor to make one, so 12 is, I can't even imagine.
It's expensive to man. Think about 280,000 people times 12 just on the payroll just to keep them in the air.
Yeah, it's basically like saying, I'm going to own 12 cities. Yeah. So, as we mentioned earlier, Darth Vader was given use of the Executor after successfully ending the threat posed by Dr. Silo. And it was originally built for General Cassio Tagg to replace his Super Star Destroyer Annihilator, which was, at the time, the largest ship in the fleet. Tagg was ultimately blamed for Silo's treachery and was demoted to a position beneath Darth Vader. Once under Vader's command, Vader sort of famously used the Force to choke Tagg to death.
Vader oversaw operation of the Executor, but it was commanded by Admiral Kendall Ozzel, and the first mission of Vader's fleet was to find the hidden rebel base in the wake of their victory at Yavin.
They scoured the galaxy until they were able to locate the rebels in the Hoth system. And under Ozzel's direction, the Executor came out of lightspeed too close to the planet, which enabled the rebels a heads up and allowed them to send up defensive shields strong enough to deflect orbital bombardment. Forced to resort to a ground assault because of Ozzel's poor decision, Vader ultimately decided to eliminate Ozzel the same way as he had Tagg, force choking him to death.
It doesn't sound like he'd be a great boss.
No, I wouldn't want to work for him, not in a million years.
So, in Ozzel's place, Vader promoted Captain Firmus Piet to Admiral and gave him command of the Executor. And Piet led the Executor through engagements to find the Millennium Falcon in the wake of the Battle of Hoth.
The Executor served with distinction and was the lead ship at the Battle of Endor. Originally, it was held in a passive blockading position with the rest of the fleet, designed to helm in the rebel war machine, which had been amassed to its largest size ever in a desperate bid to destroy the second Death Star, which was at the time in orbit over the Sanctuary Moon.
When Emperor Sheev Palpatine made known to the rebels that the under-construction Death Star was armed and operational, The Rebel fleet engaged with the Executor and the rest of Piet's flotilla, knowing that as bad as it was to attack a fleet of Imperial Star Destroyers, it was better than facing off against the Death Star's super laser.
Hoping to sow confusion in the battle and buy more time for ground elements to bring down the shield, the rebel commander from Mon Calamari, Admiral Akbar, ordered a concentrated effort to fire on the Executor. With all fighters and flagships firing at it, it was only a matter of time before its defenses fell. 2 A-Wings scored really lucky hits, destroying the geodesic domes of the shield generators.
Rebel fighter pilot Green Leader Arvin Krenid was shot down during an attack run on the Executor and lost control of his ship. It crashed through the bridge of the Executor, killing everyone in command. Without direction and battered from damage, the Executor drifted toward the second Death Star, piercing the exterior of that structure.
The last known Superstar Dreadnought-class Star Destroyer was the Ravager. It was commanded by Fleet Admiral and Counselor to the Emperor Gallius Rax. Rax was a human male from the planet of Jakku, who was instrumental in Palpatine's contingency plan, using the New Republic as pawns in that game as the mysterious figure Operator.
In the months after the Battle of Endor, and the word spread that the Ravager was the last Super Star Destroyer in the fleet, it became a prize to all of the remaining Moffs and Admirals and Commanders jockeying to fill in the power vacuum left by the Empire's defeat at Endor.
Under Rax, the Ravager was commanded by Grand Admiral Ray Sloane. It was used to initiate an attack on the planet Chandrilla, but Sloane disappeared at that point. Months later, at the Battle of Jakku, the Ravager, still under the direction of Rax and the command of Grand Moff Rand, was the center of the Imperial strategy to fend off the rebellion once more.
Rand kept the Ravager central to the fleet and kept it surrounded by the Navy's remaining Imperial-class Star Destroyers, both 1s and 2s, in an effort to prevent rebel forces under the command of Admiral Akbar from concentrating fire on it and destroying it as they had the Executor. But this proved to be the ship's downfall as well.
Once a hole in the picket line was created, opening a gap in the defense, a disabled rebel battleship, a Starhawk class named the Concorde and commanded by Commodore Kirsta Agate, was able to wreak havoc on the ship. Despite being crippled, the Concorde engaged its tractor beams and used them to drag the Ravager closer to Jakku's atmosphere. Rebel ships pounced and disabled the ship, which then crash-landed on Jakku in what would become known as the Starship Graveyard.
Many years later, an unknown scavenger that was being hunted by the First Order would use the Millennium Falcon to fly through the cannibalized engines of what used to be the Ravager.
So this has taken us through all of the stories with a factual basis, but there is also a lot of legend surrounding one ship that we really thought would be worth exploring in this episode as well. It is a really odd and troubling story. You could actually call it horrific. And even though it hasn't been substantiated, it's certainly worth including, and I imagine most of our listeners would be interested.
That ship was the Imperial I class Star Destroyer Vector. The Vector no longer appears on manifests or lists of Imperial ships or the histories, but keeping quiet the location of almost 50,000 souls is near impossible in a galaxy as large as this. So whispers of it appear in the records here and there.
And this really gets into a lot of classified Imperial information, which also explains why it's been a little scarce and hard to substantiate. Some of those archives were lost at Scarif, others were lost during Operation Cinder, so there may never ever be corroboration of this story.
So to start, we don't know who was in command of the Vector, but as the story goes, Darth Vader ordered the Vector to travel to the planet Meglamine to pick up materials that were related to a secret project codenamed Blackwing. Now, Blackwing was a top-secret Imperial bioweapons project designated as Project I-71A and called The Sickness by those who'd heard of it.
So, the Sickness was allegedly a creation of ancient Sith alchemy that attacked the tissue of living species and transformed that tissue and then the species into the undead. Vader discovered this secret and ordered a team aboard the Vector to re-synthesize it. And as the story goes, they were successful. But as always seems to happen when you really start messing with science, an accident occurred aboard the ship.
Due to the quick rate of transmission of this disease, almost the entire ship was lost to the virus. A small group of about 30 survivors, led by a commander named Gorister, holed up in a shuttle aboard the Vector. And for 10 weeks, they were stranded and were forced to resort to cannibalism to survive. When their shuttle was eventually found, only 6 remained, including Gorister.
After 10 weeks, a prison barge known as the Purge arrived. And they knew nothing of what had happened to the Vector, so the people aboard the Purge were completely in the dark. But with engine damage, the derelict Star Destroyer was the only place that they could go to find parts. So a boarding team that was led by the Purge's captain of the guard, Jareth Sartoris, went aboard to find those parts. They did find the parts that they needed, but they also got a lot more than they bargained for. They brought the plague back with them to the prison ship.
Allegedly, very few managed to escape this situation with their lives. 2 of the survivors of this catastrophe were rumored to actually be Captain Han Solo and his Wookiee first mate Chewbacca, but what they would be doing aboard an Imperial Star Destroyer or an Imperial prison barge is anyone's guess.
Yeah, that's one of those things where they really did lead such extraordinary lives that you could believe it, but they led such extraordinary lives that they were also often integrated into folklore where they really had never been. So it's hard to know.
It's one of those things, it's like, are you going to, like, no one exactly asked them about that, you know? It's probably something like, do you want to talk about Endor or that rumor about that weird ship one time? Like, were you in prison? Like, that doesn't sound like a conversation anybody would want to have.
Had I been alive at the time that Han Solo was and been introduced to him, I don't think I would have had the sheer courage to ask him such a question.
Yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to find evidence that actually happened, but there's plenty of other stories of Star Destroyers and Han Solo's life, as an aside, you know, to fill our history books, as it were.
Yes. And we'll talk, I'm sure, about many parts of that history at various points going forward.
Yeah. So that's the episode on Imperial Star Destroyers.
Which is a good one. I'm glad we did this one because I always need a lot of like reminding and refresher courses on the different types of Star Destroyers. I tend to get them muddled in my head sometimes.
Yeah, I don't think I will after researching this episode. It's interesting actually learning the geography of the wreckage on Jakku as well, where it's like, here's this ship and here, you know, it's like Jakku is almost like an undersea sort of like ship wreckage.
Yeah, very much.
You know, where you're mapping it and you're like, okay, this is this ship and this is how it went down and here's exactly who was aboard and here's what we know about it. And instead of underwater, it's all in the sand.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very similar.
And it's weird now that I can start, because of this episode, picking out like, oh, that's that ship and oh, that's this ship, and just casually watching, you know, hollow images of Jakku.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the fun part of being an amateur historian, right? You learn about things and then other things you encounter take on greater meaning.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I've got a little bit of mail.
You do?
I do.
Huzzah!
So this is probably one of my favorite emails I've ever gotten. And it essentially is basically a request to learn about things in different show topics, but it's so well written and exactly the sort of mail I want to get. I wanted to read it.
Okay.
So it starts, "Hi, Holly and Bryan. I'm Emily, a 7th-year Hufflepuff student at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I'm so excited to write now that the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy has been partially lifted. You've probably heard about Hogwarts through the story of our Harry Potter's time here. I've read the first book they put out, and honestly, Hogwarts is basically the same. I absolutely love the podcast, even if I can only get a good Wi-Fi signal on top of the astronomy tower every other Thursday. I guess wizards can't figure out Wi-Fi. What I love most is getting to learn about fantastic events outside the wizarding world. To be honest, I haven't had a real history class since my Muggle school. I have a pretty hard time paying attention to boring stuff, and well, you've probably heard about our history professor. I'm writing to you for basically that reason. I'm about to graduate Hogwarts and venture out into the wider wizarding world, and I don't know anything about how it came to be the place it is. I'm most interested in the events leading up to Minister Granger's election and how her time as minister has reshaped the magical world. I learned about the Battle of Hogwarts from Hagrid, but there aren't too many professors who really want to talk about it. Its impact certainly changed the political structure of the ministry, and I'm curious about how that influenced young Minister Granger as well. She's pretty much my hero. So you'd assume that I'd find all this stuff out in the library, but to be perfectly honest, I was banned from it after using books in the restricted section to build a homunculus of myself who can attend the classes I don't like. Professor Longbottom told me Hufflepuffs are supposed to be unafraid of toil, and I'm totally not. I just hate boring stuff. And then he told me some awesome stories about the Weasley twins, from Weasley's Wizard of Wheezes. Has any of that caught on in the Muggle world yet? In any case, thanks again for this podcast and being my window into a wider world. I'm excited to learn more as soon as I'm done with my detentions. It's okay, they're with Hagrid. He's really easy to get distracted telling us stories he's not supposed to tell. Your magical friend, Emily B.
I love it. Thank you so much for writing us, Emily.
Yeah, that's a wonderful letter. And Harry Potter, Hogwarts history is definitely on our list, or my list of things to get into. And that story you're asking about in particular is pretty well cut off in the Muggle world as well at this point. But there's some other stuff in that world that I think we'll get to eventually.
Plus, you never know. There are always new texts being discovered or new pieces of history that are unearthed, so it's always possible.
Yeah, very much so. But thank you for the email. I adored it. I've read it over and over again. So, Holly, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter as Surliest Girl, and you can find me on Instagram as SurlyGirly5. I'm also the host of a history show called Stuff You Missed in History Class, which is at missedinhistory.com, and from there you can jump to all of our social media.
And we do that Full of Sith show together.
We sure do.
And you can find that at fullofsith.com. And you can find me at Swankmatron on Twitter, and that will pretty much get you to everywhere else. You might want to be any portal to my stuff you want. You can find through Twitter, or just ask me, and I can direct you there. Or you can go to brianyoungfiction.com. But as far as Fothentic history, we love your emails. We'd love to get more of them. If you'd like to leave one, you can go to fothentichistory.com. and go to the contact page and send us a message that way. Or, you can... that's the way to get us messages. If you'd like to leave us feedback on any social media, we're at Fothentics on Twitter, Fothentic History on Facebook, and we'd love it if you left any reviews anywhere you listen to the podcast. So, Holly, is there anything else?
Nope.
Okay, well, until next time.
Indeed.